The house was engulfed in flames, and black smoke was billowing from the windows. On the floor in the corridor lay the bloody bodies of knights in armor. One of them was alive and screamed for the monster not to come near him. But a degenerate like him should have burned in hell. This novel is about an ordinary girl from Korea who is reincarnated as a minor villain named Christina. After being reborn, she struggles to survive and finds herself in a love triangle between the heroine and the two main characters. People lived on the heavenly continent, and the world tree protected them. There were transcendents who fought the monsters and guides who controlled them. The world of this novel would be peaceful if not for Bernard Lilly Janus, who at the age of 12 killed his entire family and received the title of Duke. He decided that Betty was very angry with him since she made such bastards do this. Of course, they had some misunderstandings, but it didn't have to go that far. Bernard was sure he was right, but his enemy still thought he was a real monster. Taking the knight by the lapels, he dragged him away, saying that he didn't like it when people threw all sorts of unpleasant words in his face. She called other guys handsome and attractive, but not him. Bernard thought she was being very flattering to these guys. After all, he himself didn't see anything special about them. He laughed out loud, looking at them. It wasn't that he found it funny, and he even thought that maybe he looked like a real psycho. But after apologizing, he warned that he would now kill them. The two stood in the darkness on the mountain and watched the house. This escape was not an easy test. Even rebels were used to escape from this madman. But it seems they were not enough. The rebels fell faster than expected. The guy reassured Betty, saying that Juvenal was safe and that he had helped him in many ways. Betty wanted to get away from this psycho at all costs. All who managed to escape wanted to continue their journey. But suddenly, Betty said that it would be better to go back. Her intentions were not entirely clear, but she thanked the people for the journey they had made here and asked them to convey their gratitude to the princess. And then it became clear that she was going to return to the mansion alone, but it was very dangerous. Betty said that she was safe, and even if she was caught, the Duke would not kill her. But the rest could have suffered a terrible fate. The girl didn't do it because she was too brave. She just couldn't live with the thought that others died because of her. If the Duke had already dealt with the rebels, he would still come for her and would not allow the others to escape. But everyone was worried about her, because the Duke had just destroyed the entire village guard. Escaping with 2 children while avoiding this monster is almost impossible. Layla, the confidant of the captain of the squad that the princess sent for Betty, should have understood this too. She couldn't leave the girl here and suggested that they go to the village together and part ways there. A monster blocked their path. He was glad to see Betty again. He was glad that she ran away, but she still came back. The guy covered the girl with his hand, and she asked him not to come closer, because she was afraid of him. The Duke decided that he needed to wash himself first, and he continued to approach them. Then Juvenal took out a knife and wanted to protect the girl, but the Duke silently grabbed him by the neck. Having lost consciousness, the guy began to fall. But the Duke didn't kill him. He knew that Betty enjoyed the company of this guy. The Duke didn't care what happened in the future. He wanted Betty to return to him now. Now that he thought about the battle, it seemed to him that there was nothing special about it. He said a lot of rude things because he was angry and also had a bad character. But now he wanted to make peace with Betty. He asked her for forgiveness and admitted his guilt. He was an 18-year-old Duke who did not know how to apologize and express his feelings. His body couldn't cope with the changes, and he needed a conductor to contain his power. And that conductor was Christina. However, after she became possessed, she left Duke Janus, as no one would want to stay near such a madman. The Duke became fixated on Christine, who left him for the protagonist, and eventually fell into madness. Betty was there because she was the only conductor compatible with the Duke. Someday she will leave him and live her happy life as the minor character she has become. Betty lived her second life in another girl's body in a light novel called Just a Minor Villain. The mansion where the girl worked belonged to Duke Bernhard Lilius Janus, the hidden villain of this novel. The Duke had no interest in household chores, so the mansion was a complete mess, and the fact that they hired a 10-year-old spoke volumes. But unlike the residents of this mansion, she had a clear plan. If the girl can last here for just 1 year, she will gain the necessary experience. Working in the kitchen was a good place, and Betty could have become a chef. At least being a nanny would have been nice, and she could also have become a teacher. But there was no point in worrying about it just yet. A wonderful future awaited her. But suddenly, a duke emerged from the well. Frightened, Betty hit him on the head with a bucket. But she still didn't understand how he came out of there. This could have been the end of the story of the young maid Betty. But it was not all over yet. This was the great Duke Janus, the light of the empire. Even at such a young age, he was strong. A transcendent who had slaughtered his entire clan and become a duke. He could not die from one blow. He had to get up and Betty would have to knock him out, so he had to find out who did it. And if he caught the girl, he would just kill her on the spot. And suddenly she thought, why not help him, as the heroes of short stories do? Because you have to be as kind as the main character. Betty remembered the way the heroine looked at the Duke. He asked her not to leave him because she loved him even as he was. Although no, it would have been better to just kill him. And Betty threw the bucket into the well with all her might. And now it was urgent time to get out of here. She decided to take all her things and get out of there, and at the same time change her name so that no one would find her. And she needed to run as quickly as possible. The girl decided that she would never return here again. But her plans were not destined to come true. While Betty was wondering whether it was better to take jewelry or cash, the Duke was already standing behind her. He silently placed his hand on her head, and then he said that it was cruel and asked how old the girl was. At that moment, Betty deeply regretted not finishing off this monster. She began to justify herself by saying that she was simply drawing water from the well, and her hand slipped. The Duke stopped her and asked her again how old she was. The girl was afraid to reveal her real age and said that she was 14 years old. But from the Duke's expression, it was clear that he did not believe her, and the frightened girl said that she was 13, then 12, then 11. The Duke stopped her and said that he had not asked her to count. Betty had no choice but to admit her age. Suddenly, the maid, who had been looking for her for a long time, came running. At that moment, the Duke was holding the frightened girl in his arms. Taking Betty with him like a doll, the Duke ordered the butler to be called. Attempting to assassinate the Duke was punishable by death at the very least. She never thought that the day would come when she would have to take advantage of it. Betty took some grass out of her pocket, like a drug that could make a person feel dead, and began to chew it. It was better for her to die like this than on the chopping block. Seeing this, the Duke wanted to force her to spit it out, but Betty did not give in, and the herb began to work. Her life was dedicated solely to other people. Her body existed to care for them, and her intellect to protect them. But it seems that this was just her own delusion. Betty woke up with the thought that she had to let go of the golden throne and live an ordinary, insignificant life. She decided that it was another strange dream, but still she did not die. Lowering her feet to the floor, she realized that she was in the guest room, and she decided that this was definitely the Duke's doing. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a gunshot. They were coming from the garden, and she didn't understand what was happening. Suddenly, she saw the Duke with a gun, and in front of him, the butler kneeling. The Duke asked the butler if he was right. Looking at this picture, Betty understood for sure that he was a real madman. Suddenly, one of the maids entered the room. The girl started asking her what was going on, but she asked her to speak more quietly. Anna asked her to go back to bed and not tell anyone that she had been there. Betty tried to understand what she wanted to hide from the Duke. Anna started to get angry and called the girl a disgusting orphan. The maid was trembling all over with fear, and then she began to ask Betty to help her. Betty decided she was a great bait. When Anna was leaving, she met the Duke at the threshold. He warned no one to enter the mansion. It was against the rules. She began to apologize and make excuses, saying that Betty had run away and she had tried to catch her. All this time, Betty sat in a large chest. The Duke was surprised, because the girl should have been ill. After all, the twin herb takes a very long time to be eliminated from the body. Betty's head even spun from his words. She could hardly sit in this place for several days. Betty heard the Duke say that brewing the flowers and fruits of the timi tree could cure her. The girls didn't understand why he was explaining this to Anna. But then she suddenly heard him say that the fastest way to see how something was to cut open the girl's head. After all, one of his hobbies was medicine. Betty watched in horror as his hand reached for the boards of the old chest. He was sure that even an angel could not have received such care. They would feed him, put him to bed, and even perform an operation. Betty realized with horror that the Duke had found her. Uncle Bob, who was a retired soldier, told Betty that torture was better than surgery. This was logical, as medicine at that time was at the transition level between the Middle Ages and the modern era. The brutal surgical operations could not even be called normal. There was no anesthesia, and the conditions were horribly unsanitary. The Duke, with large tongs in his hands, asked if she had washed her face. The girl answered yes with a smile on her face, but she was determined that she would not die like this. Since he is transcendent, she won't be able to hurt him anyway. So Betty decided to improvise. If she can hit him in the eyes, she'll buy herself some time. But the Duke managed to intercept her hand. He asked if she was trying to hit him again. The girl showed her hand and asked if she had washed it well. Annie laughed and said that it was wonderful. His laughter gave Betty goosebumps. And suddenly, he asked her to raise her head and not lower it. The girl couldn't understand what was happening, and the Duke asked her to look up at the ceiling. He asked if it hurt when he pressed on her eye, and Betty said no. If everything was normal with her, she would have felt it. The girl's left pupil did not move. It had become necrotic due to the poison. The girl tried to understand whether he was lying or just trying to scare her. She tried to convince the Duke that her vision was fine and that she could see normally, but that was only because her optic nerve had not yet died. Once it slowly died, she would go blind. The Duke asked her not to worry. After all, he decided to carry out the operation himself. When this girl heard this, she was terribly scared. She thought he was doing all this just for fun. The young Duke tried to convince her otherwise. He was only going to open her head a little. Betty was afraid she couldn't bear it, and she also really didn't want to die. The Duke stood silently and watched her hysteria. The girl admitted that she simply hates surgery. He asked if she was planning to run away again, but she replied that she wouldn't do that again. Suddenly, the Duke shouted that even the world tree was touched by her sincerity. Betty's left eye was normal again. He handed her a mirror so she could look at her beautiful eyes. But then she realized that he was simply lying. The Duke simply decided to joke, looking at the girl's expression. He found this joke very funny. Betty had to laugh at her too. But in her heart, she wanted to kill him as soon as possible. The Duke was confident that thanks to a surgeon like him, everything was going well, even though Betty was caught trying to escape. He asked if she knew why he didn't kill her. The Duke did not waste a single talent on his territory, and he threw the talent into the girl's hands. It was an unusual conductor of incredible power, a conductor that contains the power of the transcendent. These people were paid incredibly large amounts, but they took on a high level of risk, and even in dangerous situations, the guides remain with the transcendents. In the morning, he decided to go with Betty to the capital for a thorough examination. She couldn't even believe that she was a rank C conductor. Betty didn't want to have anything to do with this Duke anymore, but she knew she had acted too rashly. Suddenly, she remembered that today was the very day when Janus went berserk at the coronation, and Christina cleansed him. After this, she becomes his guide, gets into trouble everywhere, and dies absurdly. It turns out that the Duke should already have been in the banquet hall of the Imperial Palace, but for some reason he was still here. In the morning, the girl packed her things into a suitcase, but the Duke asked to let him see them, and then he threw out her suitcase, saying that he would buy her everything she needed in the capital. The girl felt very sorry for her things, because in the suitcase there was a dress that she had only worn once. The Duke invited her to get into a limousine. She had never seen such cars, even in her past life. Footman Gilbert often helped Betty. He was also very sweet and handsome. The girl thanked him for his help. Janus noticed how she was looking at the footman and asked if she liked guys like that. And then he added that it was good that he didn't kill him last night. It was a joke, and the Duke asked why the girl wasn't laughing. Still, no one died last night. He just scared everyone so they would keep a better eye on the mansion. Betty could tell he was bored and looking for an excuse to hunt. Ultimately, the Duke will sponsor the girl regardless of her rank, and after training, she will remain under his control as a guide. But Betty didn't want to get involved with this crazy guy who uses guns for fun when he's bored. He killed all his relatives and inherited the mansion after only 2 years. He needed an adult to restrain him. Betty knew she was unlikely to correct him, and it was better for her to avoid him, so she checked to see if she really needed to go to the capital. But he suddenly asked why she got into the car if she didn't want to go. The Duke asked if she knew how much the average conductor earned. This amount was a little more than she would have earned in the kitchen. He promised that if she studied well, he would make her rich. But it wasn't just about money. Being a conductor is too dangerous. Betty wouldn't mind being a maid or something like that, like a normal person. But she couldn't tell the Duke this, so she simply said that she was afraid of the capital. Janus didn't even know that she was such a scared cat. He asked why she wanted to kill him and run away. From the Duke's perspective, she looked fearless, but in reality, it was all about survival. The Duke very kindly offered to support him by the hand, but it really was calmer this way. He definitely felt something when he came into contact with such a powerful transcendent. It was like a gentle breeze. This is how cleansing it felt. The transcendent, like Duke Janus, could not be held by one or two guides. For example, the protagonist of this novel, Duke Gladio, had 10 guides, all talented people from noble families. Betty asked if after training she would be his personal guide. He sent her to school for free. She could have endured it for 10 years and finished. But after 1 year with him, her cost would skyrocket. And at the moment, he really had no guides. The girl asked why this happened. Janus said that they all died, because he had gone a little crazy some time ago. After this story, the girl really wanted to jump out of the car. Betty carefully opened the door to the Duke's office. She was told that he called her. He asked why she wasn't wearing the clothes he bought for her. The dresses were very beautiful. The girl even had the idea of selling them, and the Duke suspected it. But Betty pretended that this was not the case at all. The Duke ordered her to change her clothes immediately. The maids in the capital were much more disciplined. Among them, Lucy stood out, a highly qualified maid who carried out all instructions perfectly. Betty dreamed of becoming a professional like her. She thought Lucy was really cool. Lucy tidied up the girl's hair, and she did it with incredible ease, creating incredible beauty in just 26 minutes. She was a perfect example of a maid, perhaps earning around 50 gold pieces a year. The Duke wanted to apply to the school soon, but in any case, she had to stay here until she passed the conductor exam. The Duke asked if her name was really Betty, and he began to write a statement. They go. Betty hesitated a little. Janus explained that this is the name she will be called by throughout her time at school. Only the girl said that her full name was Beatrice. Upon hearing this, the Duke was a little surprised and asked if the name was really like Sinclair and Beatrice. It was the equivalent of Romeo and Juliet in our world, so the name Beatrice has already become a household name, like Cinderella. The Duke began to laugh at the girl, and she decided that she really should have killed him at the well. Betty knew there would be a lot of kids at school with similar names, like Elizabeth or Alexandra, and she would stand out a little with that name. But this idiot understood how she felt, and he suggested that she change her name. The Duke was already rolling on the floor laughing. The table was full of all kinds of sweets. The Duke apparently wasn't satisfied with dragging the girl around the capital all day. Now he decided to mock her by constantly calling her Lady Beatrice. The girl drank tea silently. Janus suggested that she eat cookies, since after entering school, she would not have access to such food. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. The Duke asked to let the guests in. This was the true heroine of the novel, Lady Christina from the Count's family. As Betty thought, the heroes are immediately recognizable by their distinctive appearance. She came immediately after she learned from the newspaper that the Duke was ill at the coronation. It turned out that Christina was not present at the coronation. This means that at the coronation, there was no guide to restrain the distraught Duke. So he somehow managed to restrain himself and eventually appeared at the well in the backyard of the mansion. In any case, the conclusion was obvious. It looks like someone is rewriting the plot and ruining Betty's chances for a normal life. Christina asked how the Duke was feeling now. He said that he was fine because his guide was nearby. Christine couldn't believe what he was talking about this child. Janus explained that she had not yet received an education, but already showed good promise. Smiling, Christina met the girl. Betty said that she had arrived in the capital for training and was a little confused. Christina was a real villain before she reunited with the Duke. No matter who is next to him, she will not tolerate it. So Betty had to take care of herself. Christina presented the Duke with a gift in the form of a bouquet of white hyacinths. In emergency situations where transcendentals cannot control themselves, they often use white hyacinth extract. The Duke also used it. Christina must really want to win the Duke's favor, but he was not one to appreciate such efforts. At the beginning of the novel, he appeared as the second main male character. Because of its enormous but unstable power, no conductor could contain it. The only chance to survive to adulthood was to find a guide practically. And then he met Christina. She was an incredible girl, worthy of the title of main character, a universal guide. And Janus used it as his personal instrument of purification. He was also a womanizer with a disgusting character, and he became obsessed with her. And after this, Christina ran away to the main character. After this, Janice completely turned into a villain. Betty, of course, liked this sad ending. But suddenly, someone else entered the room. The girl began to scold Christina for leaving immediately after getting out of the carriage. It was Elena McKean, Christina's older sister. She was about 16 years old. It was an honor for her to meet the Duke. Janice replied that he remembered her, having seen her at one of the balls. But this was definitely not true. Elena was also one of the characters who suffered from the Duke. So, like a true villain, he decides to play with her. Suddenly, several more young ladies entered the room. These were Elena's friends. The Duke called Zion and asked him to go for a walk with Betty. The Duke was an incorrigible idiot and would later become the most terrible villain who would destroy this world. This creature also prevented Christina and Janice from meeting at the coronation, apparently in the hope that he himself would die in his youth. The young Duke survived even though he was facing death. And after that I met Betty, a guide for whom he would go to great lengths. Therefore, the girl's role will simply disappear from his sight. She must act in such a way that the young boy can live peacefully and the world remains intact. Betty was brought to the largest dollhouse store. After all, they went to buy toys, and if she wants something else, she will have to say so. This man turned out to be surprisingly kind to the child, but was so stern in front of the Duke. Betty was offered lemonade, because the Duke had bought a lot of different desserts for her. The girl took it, but such care was not very pleasant. She was already planning to run away, leaving them behind. Although there were kind and nice people around her, but she felt uneasy when she imagined how, because of her, they would get a scolding from the Duke. She really felt sorry for them, but there was nothing she could do. After all, Betty was not the embodiment of kindness. She spilled lemonade on her dress, and they asked to stop them for a moment. The driver did everything, saying that there was a shopping area nearby, and suggested that we take a walk there with the child. Then the servant invited Betty to go into the studio. Betty asked not to worry, and to take something cheaper. The cheap fabric was not of the best quality. The girl could catch a cold in it in such weather. Betty did all this just to get away. The kind girl asked if the girl wanted to see anything else. For example, new dresses for the winter season. They needed to get something urgently now, but Betty kindly promised to come again. And now they were supposed to bring her what she ordered. At this point, Betty asked where the toilet was. The owner of the studio offered to accompany the girl. This place is indeed geared towards children, but this will make it easier to escape. The mistress stopped the servant, saying that the girl needed personal time. Betty mentally apologized to Anton. Having closed the door behind her, she apologized to the girls. The girl climbed onto the chest of drawers that stood by the window. Looking out the window, she decided that this was necessary for peace and quiet in this world. And she jumped down from the window, but she landed on some young man, who told her that if she kept jumping like that, she would definitely break something. He asked if the girl was hurt. She was fine and thanked him. Betty asked what the young man's name was. It was Yus, and he was 10 years old. Although they were the same age, he was significantly taller than the girl. He asked Betty if she came from a rich family. Apparently, he was misled by her clothes, but that's not surprising. Let him better think that she is really rich. Yus handed the girl a card, and then he said that if she needed to kill someone, she should let him know. This applied to anyone, without distinction, because thanks to the poisonous tooth, it was possible to quickly and without trace complete the matter. Travel outside the capital was paid for separately. A world where children's rights were not protected was truly impressive. The elders carried out the dangerous tasks, while Yus only gave orders. Betty admitted to him that she was not rich, and he asked how she was able to buy all these things. She couldn't think of anything better than to steal this dress from the studio, and now she's trying to escape. Taking the girl by the hand, Yus said that in that case she had nothing to do here. Betty would also be happy to get rid of this dress. Yus offered her to swap with someone. For a small fee, someone would agree, but the girl had no money. But her new acquaintance had a lot of money. A lot. And earned 60 albans in a year. Betty asked again if he really made that much money from cutting off heads. Yus asked if she liked rich people, and the girl answered that she did. If she liked Yus, he could earn even more. Betty understood that no matter what dirty methods he used to earn money, he was too naive to work. It seemed that the girl had made a friend for the first time, but she had a hard time figuring out why he became so attached to the first person he met. This is what life was like for abandoned children. They had naive dreams, but they were intertwined in their destinies with harsh reality. Whatever one may say, Betty was lucky to meet such a simpleton. He could be very useful to her. Betty asked to go to work with him. Yus was surprised and asked what she would do there. The girls needed to lay low for a while, and the Assassin's Guild was the most suitable place. But the Yus don't want her to do this. In this matter, ill-considered sympathies were a weakness, and Betty could not miss such a weakness. If he didn't want to take her, then she would look for another way. Turning around, she walked in the other direction, thanking him for his help. Yus followed up by saying that he couldn't just take anyone and was simply recommending her. This suited Betty. Yus brought the girl to his boss. It was an ordinary house. I asked if they really had an office disguised like that. Nick answered from behind the door, and Yus asked where the boss was. But he replied that he didn't know. Yus didn't know what to do, because he needed his boss's permission. But he might not return anytime soon. Betty asked if he was going to leave. But at that moment, Nick came out and announced that a new case had appeared. Yus closed Betty's eyes because he came out almost naked. But Betty herself spoke to Nick, telling him that she and Yus were friends, and she asked him to bring her here because she wanted to work here. Nick asked if the girl even knew where she was. Children could be given all sorts of dirty work to do, but they are small, dirty, and cost less, which is why Yus earned so much last year. But Betty came for a completely different job. She asked if they needed a servant. Nick replied that this is not his uncle's house. Noticing that the house was dirty, the girl said that this might attract attention, that the owner had been absent for a long time, but it was a bluff. Nick just listened to her and smiled, and then he asked her to look at the documents, and instead she handed him a wad of money. She said her name was Meg, and she was 16 years old. She had just left the Ursula shelter, and she had nowhere to live. If she is given shelter and food, she will gladly take on household chores. She said that she had already worked in one house, but made a mistake and ran away. Nick realized that she wanted to change her identity. The guild head was supposed to return in a couple of days, and the girls allowed me to stay for now. Yus and Betty were very happy about this. Guildmaster Nina was very happy to see Meg. Nick tried to send her to bed. Betty realized from the infection that she was drunk. Nina was with Nick's twin sister and the head of the guild, and she turned out to be very kind to the girl. Meg helped with everything from household chores to simply assisting the killers. Nina was simply touched by little Meg. Yus asked when the girl would finish washing the dishes, and I wanted to help her so that she would finish faster. He even said that he knows how to do it. Betty decided to see how he would handle it, but he wasn't very good at handling the dishes. Nick came up to them and asked what they were doing. He took the plates from Yus, and he began to wash the dishes himself. All the dishes were washed very quickly. Nick asked if the boy was going to see his brother, and he replied that he would buy some oil on the way and go to him. Nick sent Meg to bed and said he would do the rest himself. Considering the lives of these people, they were very kind, but they risked much more here than the girl. But Betty, despite their kindness, could not stay here for long. She wanted to spend a year here and then leave. But suddenly, someone's voice woke her up. It was the Duke, and he said that if she continued to behave like this, there would be no school, and he would simply lock her in the mansion. Nina was unhappy that someone was taking Meg, but Janus replied that he was her guardian. He explained that the girl had run away from home, and now he was taking her in. Realizing that it was the very same Duke in front of her, Nina bowed to him and asked him to take good care of the girl. In the morning, Nick asked if Meg was awake, but when he turned around, he saw that a stranger was holding her in his arms. Seeing that it was the Duke, he did not stop him and wished him a safe journey. The Duke threw him a sack with payment. When they got into the car, Janus was silent. Betty spoke first and asked what would happen to Lucy and Anton now. But the Duke only replied that he was not a madman who killed everyone in a row. He said that they were alive and well, and the girl was very happy about it. Janus said that it had been very hard for him this whole week. He turned the whole city upside down to find her, and now he forbids her to leave the house until the exams are over. After all, this time he let her go for only a minute, and she managed to escape. The Duke was, of course, her master, but they had only a business relationship. She was not his property. She didn't want to become a guide. She didn't want to be fed and watered. So how could this nobleman lock a man up? Unable to bear it, Betty screamed that she didn't want all this. But the Duke asked unequivocally if she really thought that only she could be angry. The Duke was informed that the purification might be quick, But that did not necessarily mean the conductor was good. The results were supposed to be sent within 2 weeks. The girl no longer wanted anything. Her legs hurt. She sat in her room for a month and a half. Although all this time, she had new toys and first-class food. The Duke said she had no idea how difficult it was to find her. Betty replied that there was no need to look for her, and Janus didn't like these words at all. Looking at his reaction, the girl thought she had gone a little too far. The Duke asked if she really thought he would forgive her, just because she made cute faces. He grabbed her cheeks, but it hurt. But for him, it was normal because she was punished. And every sentence the girl starts with the words, "I don't want to." Suddenly, someone removed the Duke's hand. It was Earnhardt Ignia Gladio. In the novella, he was with Christine. He stood up for the girl, saying that she was a child and she was in pain. Janus reminded them that they were in a temple, and he called on Earnhardt to remember his situation. After all, officially, the title of minor duke was not considered a title, and in noble society, he cannot even be the first to greet someone with a higher title. And he apologized to the Duke for his actions. He saw injustice towards the child, and without thinking, made a mistake. But the Duke replied that if he survived his first expedition, he would forgive him. The expedition meant going into dangerous lands, fighting monsters, and collecting valuable resources. The expeditions were vital for collecting materials and further creating artifacts that were essential for human survival. This was the purpose of the existence of transcendence and guides. The little Duke went into the temple to prepare for his first expedition, and the Duke mocked the one who was about to go through what he had already gone through. But the little Duke did not exterminate entire families for the sake of a title. Janus asked Betty if she liked the place they had come to. And after that, he took her to the ballet. I bought her a bunch of new toys, and they had dinner at an incredibly expensive restaurant. It was like going back in time a month and a half ago. Betty really didn't know anything. That girl simply asked her to help and change clothes, but where she went next was unknown. Even when the Duke set out on his first expedition, he was not as frightened as he was now. He turned the whole city upside down like a madman to find her, and it turned out that she lived like a princess in the Assassin's Guild. He himself didn't understand how he could so easily fall into her trap. Everyone in the mansion was glad to see her return, ever since the girl ran away, and she felt very uncomfortable in front of these two people. But it turned out that they blamed themselves for her running away. Betty could not reject the apologies of such kind people. And then the girl was told that the Duke was waiting for her. She had no choice but to go to him. Janus asked her to come closer. He called her into his room to show her that he had repainted the walls white. Betty thought it was some kind of trap. He asked the girl to tell him her honest opinion why only one room was white. From that day on, the Duke's behavior never ceased to surprise her. He started feeding her and asking if she liked it. When she woke up in the morning, the furniture was missing from the room. The Duke suggested that she find it herself, since he had hidden it somewhere in the mansion. That's why these people, like Cinderella, looked for her in a huge mansion. All the furniture and things were in different places. Betty couldn't allow herself to cry, because that was the work of fools. But she couldn't stand it anymore and wanted to just be killed. The Duke looked at her with a smile and asked if she had found everything. She just wanted to kill him in the hope that the priests would understand her. The next day, she needed to find the rest of her things. The girl decided that this was punishment for running away and apologized. But the Duke explained that this was not a punishment at all. At that time, we didn't understand at all why he was doing this to her, and we were already thinking about a third escape. The Duke wrote a letter of thanks to Lady Emma for the valuable lessons she had taught him in raising Betty. Her advice and tips helped him a lot. Now all that remains is to teach her to read before school. The Duke called Betty to him. He told her to come in and sit down. She sat on his lap, and he showed her the letter. She saw her name in the text. There was written the full name Beatrice. He held the girl's hand, and together they traced out letter after letter. But in the end, they wrote the Duke's full name, Bernhardt Leary Janus. He believed that knowing his name would be much more useful for the girl than knowing her own. But then he showed her real name in the text and asked to write it himself. The girl turned out to have a talent for writing, and she could easily learn to read several books. Betty would really like to learn to read. She didn't even have time to read all the books he sent to her room. At this time, a letter arrived with a decision on admission to school. Betty read everything in a row, and she couldn't resist taking the letter. She took some more papers, but they were very boring. Suddenly, she saw a book in the Duke's desk. It had "Our Hated Child" written on it. There was written about one thing that needed to be known. While looking at the book, she didn't even notice how the Duke entered the office. He even frightened the girl with his appearance. She handed him an envelope with a gold seal, containing the results of the conductor test. Betty couldn't tell from his expression what he was thinking. The girl asked the Duke to let her look at the contents of the envelope. Now she could read everything herself. She was awarded a rank, but she didn't expect anything else. The Duke supported her, saying that such a result was quite good. Without guides and transcendence, the heavenly continent would have collapsed long ago. Compatibility with Janus was 98%. Even Christina had 95% with him. The girl was very angry about this rank. The Duke tried to calm her down, saying that it didn't matter at all. Besides, she had no reason to come down to Earth. Suddenly, the Duke said that he would not allow her to go down there. Betty asked why he was training her if he wasn't going to take her on expeditions. But she knew that in order to complete her studies, she would have to go down at least once. It would be something like an internship. The Duke asked her to let him know when the team was assembled, so that everyone would be as good as silk. He also wanted to see the list of assigned groups and instructors. Betty realized that he wanted to buy her participation in the expedition. The girl was a little scared by the fact that everyone would know that she had graduated from school dishonestly, and no one would want to sign a contract with her. Then she will remain his personal guide. Janus knew from the very beginning that everything would turn out this way. He also found out that she would receive a low rank and just wanted to use her for purification. He also acted as the main character Christina in the original story. Betty didn't mind being used, but only if she herself benefited from it. But with the Duke, this was unacceptable. She tried to understand him several times. On the surface, he was always calm, but inside, he was as dangerous as a time bomb. If the girl makes a mistake, she will be drawn into uncontrollable rage. The Duke promised to protect her regardless of rank, but if a person did something unusual for themselves, it meant that they would soon die. He asked Betty to stop looking at him. She sincerely hoped that it was all true. 3 years later, at the home of the Earl of McKean's family, Elena's father asked if dinner was ready. The girl tried to prepare everything in advance since lunchtime was moved. His lordship was due to arrive soon, so tea had to be taken care of. But the youngest son, Matthias, was against his sister going out. He believed that he was taking care of order in the house as the future head of the family. Christina, hearing this, just burst out laughing. He was undoubtedly a count, but if he wanted to continue living in luxury, he had to start taking care of his conductor, Christina, with his rank. Elena reminded the children that she had asked them to behave calmly. The count reminded her that if her mother were alive and saw the mess, she would be very unhappy. The girls needed to get ready because they had an important guest. The butler announced that Count Janus had arrived. He arrived with Betty because without support, he would have to wait until next year to graduate. But this only played into the girl's hands, so he asked him to keep quiet. He even forbade her to say the words "no" and "I don't want to." And then he said that she could do whatever she wanted because he would do the same. Count McKean came out to greet his dear guests. Janus was glad to meet him after a long time. The father introduced his eldest daughter, Elena, to him. Janus remembered that they had seen each other before. After that, he introduced Betty to them. Betty said that thanks to the Duke's grace, she plans to start at the school this spring as a guide. Elena realized that this child was going to enter school with Christina. For the sake of this child, the Duke sacrificed 30% of the emerald mining rights in the duchy. This was the condition that she, like Christina, could enter school with a class guide. Her school life would become easier. It seems that, contrary to rumors, he really was kind to children, or she was special. Everyone was busy with things that interested them. Elena asked if the girl liked the food. I especially appreciated the croakerfish and pheasant meat. She said that before meeting the Duke, she worked in the kitchen, which is why she was so knowledgeable about meat and fish. Elena offered her a choice of a book to read or dessert. Betty looked very well-mannered and kind, but suddenly, Matthias called her a dirty girl, and Elena didn't like it at all. She asked him to apologize to the guests, but he replied that Betty was to blame for having to endure all this. He said that in the wild, anyone who doesn't fight back gets eaten. But suddenly, they saw that Christine was not in the room. Even the maid didn't know where she went, but she didn't want to go look for her. I think that a person of higher status should do this. First, Elena needed her sister, and she decided to deal with the rest later. She warned her brother to stop being rude. Let me assure her that everything will be okay with them and she can go calmly. Elena promised to return soon. She asked the children to play while she went to the toilet. Mateus watched as Betty read a book. The girl was, of course, prepared for this, but for her it was some kind of horror. She wanted to impress Elena and tell her that Jane was a thief because she didn't even notice who stole her earring. But Mateus irritated her and called her ugly, and that her hair is braided terribly. His bad character was well described in the novel, but in real life he was only irritating. He got on her nerves so much that she had to raise her voice. When he noticed the freckles on her face, he said it was just awful. He tried his best to get her angry. He thought Betty should thank him for being so nice to her. He didn't give a damn about her opinion. He demanded an apology from her. Betty couldn't resist and hit him on the head with the book with all her might. And pleased with herself, she left the room. Mateus, having come to his senses, would be seriously angry. He caught up with the girl and told her to come to him, but she seemed not to hear him and turned the corner. But he knew that she would not be able to escape from someone else's house, and not seeing her, he decided that she was hiding. The only place she could do this was the closet. But surprisingly, she wasn't there. Suddenly, Betty appeared behind him, and pushing him into the closet, she closed the doors. And so that he couldn't get in, she stuck a mop in. The boy was extremely unhappy that we treated him like that. She answered him in his own words, that he was stupid to tolerate such treatment. Mateus shouted from the closet that she was crazy. Now, he still had to work hard to get out of there. Elena finally managed to find Christina. She eavesdropped on adults' conversations. Taking her hand, Elena demanded that she follow her. Suddenly, the disgruntled father came out and asked what all the noise was about in front of the guests. Christina threw herself on his neck and said that she missed him very much. She asked the Duke's permission to stay with her father, promising to behave quietly. And he gave permission. Elena apologized for the inconvenience. Looking at her, Janus pointed out that she was missing one earring. Elena didn't even notice when she lost it. She thanked the Duke for telling her about it. The girl began to remember the last time she checked her earrings. She couldn't afford to lose her mother's things. Suddenly, she remembered that she had left Betty alone. Elena hurried back into the room and found out how the children were doing. But at this time, Betty was there alone and eating dessert. She said she didn't know where Mateus and Jane were. For Elena, everything was obvious. Jane has already abandoned the children in her absence more than once, and her brother is most likely hanging around somewhere. She was glad that Betty remained in the room without any problems. Elena asked if she was bored. At this time, Christina came into the room and said that Betty needed to be taken downstairs to listen to the piano playing. She also boasted that the Duke called her the best girl in the world. Betty remembered something from her past life. She made her little brother cry by saying that Santa doesn't exist. Now she couldn't afford to step on the same rake. Boasting, Christina asked if she envied her, but she promised to behave well with her at school and take her with her every day, just like her maid Sophia. Suddenly, she asked where he was. An irritated Christina asked who ate all her chocolate. She put it aside specifically to give it to the Duke. She specifically asked the chef to make chocolate from her dream. Betty admitted that Jane ate it so deliciously that she decided to try it too. But none of the servants bothered to convey her request that the chocolate not be touched. Christina tried to figure out who took the chocolate. After everything that had been seen, it even seemed that Christina would become the next head of the family. But then she remembered that she would be possessed, and the title of head of the family would go to Elena, and Mateus would never become the head. Because of her fragile nature, she will be tossing and turning. But Betty needed Elena to escape from Janus. She tried to convince Christine that it didn't matter who ate the chocolate. Christine asked what Elena ate. Then she asked the maid to bring Jane and Sophie. Christina asked Betty this question too. Now it was necessary to make it so that the culprit of the one who ate all the chocolate was Jane. Christina warned that Betty would do well to remember everything she ate. The girl said she ate apple pie, strawberry milk, caramel pudding, and waffles. But I remembered that the nanny really liked that chocolate. Christina asked if she could answer for her words. The maid returned and said that Jane was nowhere to be found. Then she asked where Sophie was. Out of breath, Sophie ran into the room and said that she had not had time to convey Mistress Jane's words because she had gone to get a dress for the girl. But Christina didn't want to listen to her excuses. She asked to find Jane again. Everyone started going downstairs to listen to the piano. Christina said that Jane always does something shameful for show. Betty said that in her homeland, they say that eating well brings good luck. Christina asked not to embarrass her at school with food and other things, because social life was difficult. Then she asked Betty if she also communicated with the Duke. Christina liked that Betty pretended to be naive, but acted completely differently. After all, it is better to be cunning than stupid. Betty thanked her for these words. Downstairs, everyone had already gathered to listen to the sounds of the piano. Father asked why Christina came so late, and she told him about the chocolate. Count McKean seemed like the perfect father who loved his children. But in reality, this was not the case. He only took care of his children when necessary. At first, this guy really irritated Betty. Well, even Christina didn't doubt her father's love. She told Janus that someone had eaten the delicious pink chocolate that was meant for him. But the Duke didn't care about that. Suddenly, he noticed that Betty was squeezing her hands strangely. He asked to unclasp them and show them. Betty thought that everything would now resolve itself naturally. Seeing traces of pink chocolate on her hands, Christina began to scream. But Betty said it was all a ploy to set her up. Christina was beside herself with rage, and she had enough reasons to be angry. At this moment, Betty decided to run away. Meanwhile, the Duke was holding back Christina. She wanted to leave a good impression so much that she showed her true colors. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a disheveled Matthias appeared and called Betty a crazy fool. She didn't even think that he would be able to free himself so quickly. The butler tried to calm him down. Betty mentally thanked this nameless butler. But still, he almost caught up with her. There was nowhere to run. There was only one room ahead. Matthias correctly followed that she would not live. But suddenly, the Duke appeared on his way. Matthias began to justify herself by saying that it was Betty who first locked him in the closet. Hearing this, the father began to scold him and say that he did not know his place. Janus didn't think his child would be so hated here. I hoped that they could become close friends. Christina began to justify herself by saying that she didn't want anything like that. The brother didn't see Betty's fault in anything except that she ate the prepared dessert, and he asked for forgiveness for her. And Matthias spoke so indistinctly that it was impossible to understand what he was saying. So the Duke decided to file a formal complaint to get things sorted out. Count McKean began to shout that it was all his fault, and that he had spoiled his children too much. Duke Janus didn't even bat an eyelid and remained a duke in any situation. He suggested that Christina send him a check for the damages and a complaint from her brother. Christine started saying that everything was fine, and she was glad that Betty liked the chocolate. At that moment, Betty felt very sorry for Elena. After all, when they leave, her father will definitely take it out on her, and she will be left alone with her grief, pouring out her soul in a diary. The Duke asked the girl to ignore all this and said that he would find her better friends. Earl McKean began to ask what about the mineral rights, or if the Duke could exchange them for cash at the bank. The Duke promised to send a man for this later. The Count waited impatiently for his decision. Christina mentally apologized to Elena for ruining the atmosphere, and I prepared a little surprise for her. Elena was truly very worried about all the events of that evening. Suddenly, the maid asked if she should put away what was in the pocket of her dress, but she clearly remembered that there was nothing there. The maid's friend took out a lost earring with a note from the Flower Fairy. Legend has it that on New Year's Eve, the Flower Fairy awakens the pure hearts of children and makes their wishes come true. On the first day of the new year, it was customary to hold a holiday for children. The Duke told Betty that she must write down on the dance card everyone who invites her. But the girl was very worried, because she had a terrible sense of rhythm from her past life. When she sang, completely new melodies emerged, and her movements were no different from a creaky wooden doll. The Duke reassured her by saying that other children would likely be the same. He helped her out of the carriage. But still, this also worried the Duke a little, because he was present at her dance lessons every time. Betty was presented with a red rose at the entrance, but the girl seemed paralyzed by the woman's gaze. She could barely say thank you. The mountain guardians who watched over the world tree never aged because they had given their souls to it. It was very strange that Betty was scared because of this. It was not fear, but animal terror. She decided to ask the Duke if the man who gave her the flower was someone outstanding. The Duke explained that the man was wearing a purple sash, which meant that he was a cardinal. They were just human shells. They couldn't feel emotions or desires. Even if someone cut off their hand, they would look at it in bewilderment. Pope Ambrosio was the first servant of the World Tree and the princess's closest confidant. Everyone was already having fun at the party. The arrival of Duke Janus and his ward Betty was announced. There were so many people around that the girl felt uneasy, and you could hear what everyone was whispering about. Before them was the Tree of Life, supporting the heavenly continent, the World Tree. Betty never thought that the day would come when she would see something like this. The Duke's great sacrifice for the good of humanity was not forgotten, but the girl couldn't understand why she was so nervous. Having a familiar face nearby made my soul feel calmer. Matthias was telling the other kids how ugly Betty was. He said her hair looked like cotton candy, and she had so many freckles, it looked like she had been sprinkled with sugar. And she also looked like a squirrel. When Betty caught up with Matthias, he started pointing his finger at her and shouting. In the capital, gossip spread very quickly, and from that day on, a rumor spread that Count McCain was in favor of Duke Janus, and all because the Duke, buying up candy, showered the McKeans with it. Few in the Empire could afford such arbitrariness, but despite the rumors, the Duke remained calm. He reminded Betty to keep an eye on her dance card. Without a dance card, it was impossible to remember who you were dancing with. But the pencil included in the set allowed you to write down the name of the person who suggested the dance. Here you can see the concern for the children, because there were plenty of treats, and the ball ended before midnight, so there would be no need to fight off drowsiness. At this ball, Betty met little Duke Gladio again. She was glad to see him here. He complimented Janus by saying that Betty was very smart, but the Duke replied that he had heard this so many times that he had stopped answering. The young man who approached told Gladio that he would like to meet his interlocutor. Betty couldn't believe her eyes. Before her was a man of noble spirit, with a sympathetic and altruistic character. It was Duke Lucifer Saul. He never refused to help those in need, and participated in various charitable projects and programs to help the poor. He will be a great ally for Betty's escape in the future. Lucifer was honored to meet the girl, and asked if she had a spot on the dance card, and he offered to accompany Betty to the first dance. But suddenly, Janus approached them and said that Betty's first dance was already taken, and asked them to arrange another one. The girl was very angry at the Duke for this. Janus calmly explained that the first dance was his by definition. He thought it was obvious to everyone, so he didn't say anything in advance. Smiling, Lucifer signed up for the second dance on Betty's card. The girl walked along the corridor of the castle and thought that she could no longer tolerate the Duke. Suddenly, she overheard a conversation between two young men who wanted to make friends with the guys before enrollment. Betty stood to the side, because with her status, she couldn't start a conversation until someone spoke first. Suddenly, someone placed a wreath of flowers on Betty's head. When Betty turned around, the girl said that she had confused her with her friend, and then she asked her name. This is how Betty met a girl named Elizabeth Valentina. Then Elizabeth introduced her to her older brother Alex, who introduced her to his childhood friend Alexandra. She, in turn, introduced Betty to her older sister, Roselia, and Roselia turned out to be Elena's close friend. And since they met as equals, Elena asked Betty to call her by her first name. It was very good that from that day on, Elena treated her warmly. Suddenly, Elizabeth was told that Alex had not been seen anywhere recently. At this time, two guys approached Alex to talk. They said that Alex and Alexandra were the bride and groom, but he asked them not to slander the lady. But they began to imitate the guy. Alexandra saw from behind the bushes where Alex was. She guessed that he might have met Marine's gang, but Betty was hearing about them for the first time. The tallest of them was the son of the Marquis of Marine, which is why their gang was so nicknamed. The Moran family had produced outstanding figures over the generations, so the Marquis of Marine was the least known of such marquises. Betty knew that guys like that usually fall apart if their leader is removed. Alexandra was in a very belligerent mood, but Betty said that she would simply talk these guys into it and bring Alex. Alexandra was very worried whether everything would be okay, but if they went together, everything would certainly end in a fight. Although it would have been nice to give these guys a good beating, Alexandra didn't take some things into account. Alexandra was the daughter of a baron, and the children of the Marin gang were the offspring of families of the level of marquises and counts. Besides, these boys were stronger than them, and they would hardly have emerged victorious from this fight. Besides, Betty had a little authority behind her, so it was best for her to go. The girls thought about what they needed to tell Roselia that they had found Alex, but they couldn't just take him and leave him, although Elena was probably worried too. But Elizabeth decided that Betty was a good talker and could get Alex out safely. The girls warned Betty that if something happened, she should shout to them. Betty was glad that Elizabeth believed her words. The boys continued to make fun of Alex, but suddenly they saw Betty approaching them, and Mateus recognized her. Marine heard that they were looking for the boy and told him to get lost. He asked the girl if she was Betty. It turned out that Mateus whined about her so much that he remembered her name. They started making fun of him because the simpleton was able to lock him in the closet, but Mateus tried to justify himself and said that commoners were very hypocritical. Now the bullying has also hit Mateus himself. Marin asked Betty for her dance card. He began to examine it and asked why Lucifer's name was there. The girl said that he asked for a second dance. Then Marin said that the first dance would be his. Betty decided that Janus was to blame for not filling out the card. Marin couldn't understand why everyone liked Lucifer so much, because he was always turning his nose up at him. In the original, Duke Lucifer was kind to those weaker than him. However, since he was the son of a duke, the vast majority of the empire was weaker than him, and so Lucifer, like a fool, was generous to everyone around him. Duke Janus most likely wanted to offer Betty hand-picked friends, but she was afraid to trust people selected for money. Betty asked the Marquis of Marin to come to the fountain before the dance. She wanted to tell him something personally so that Duke Lucifer wouldn't hear it. Hearing this, he happily agreed. Betty was glad that he turned out to be so simple. Betty asked Alex why he hadn't left yet, since she had been deliberately stalling to give him a chance. But he was afraid to leave the girl alone with these guys. Betty and Alex returned to the others together. The boy handed Elizabeth a flower, which she wanted to look at closer. But she didn't really like the fact that he put himself in danger just because of this flower. Betty couldn't understand what was happening. The lady thought that the children were fine, since boys always got into fights, so there was no need to worry about it. But they explained to her that it was not just a fight. Alex was alone against a crowd of boys. She asked not to tell her father about this, because he would be disappointed that Alex could not stand up for himself. Betty assumed that the matter would be hushed up with the intervention of adults. But the children were not very happy with this outcome. Then Betty decided to tell them her plan. But it was a big secret for the others. When I heard what she decided to do, the girls were horrified. The girls began to worry that they might be caught. Betty explained that they needed to prepare everything so that they would never get caught. But, on the other hand, they were very happy to make life at least a little more difficult for Marquis Marin. First, they needed the Tommy fruit. It changed the voice if eaten. Today it is difficult to get, so you have to look for it in the greenhouse. Next, they will need to borrow a mini loudspeaker from the musicians. And then all that was left to do was wait for this idiot at the fountains. And now he has finally come to the right place. It was time to start implementing their bold plan. The girls took out a loudspeaker, and turning to the heir of the Marin family, they called upon him to hear their call. At first, they thought he had figured them out. Marquis Marin actually thought that the flower fairy was speaking to him, and this meant that he had fallen for one of the girls' tricks. They continued to carry out their plan. Words came through the loudspeaker that the Marquis's pure thirst for power had awakened the fairy from her long sleep. The Marquis was glad that the fairy really existed. In this world, the flower fairy was something like Santa Claus. Most of the children assumed that it was the servants who brought the gifts, and not the flower fairy, but it turned out to be so easy to be deceived. The fairy's voice told the Marquis that she would fulfill any of his wishes in order to repay him, but he did not see her anywhere. Suddenly, a voice said that this was unforgivable. He was brought in as just a pathetic mortal and dared to want to see an immortal with his own eyes. Greatly frightened, the Marquis began to apologize, but the fairy still asked him to name his wish. The Marquis wished to marry the most beautiful, wisest, and purest woman in the world, because this would help him wipe Duke Lucifer's nose. Hearing this, the girls couldn't help but laugh. The situation was critical, because they couldn't afford to screw up. Marquis asked if the fairy heard him and asked her not to rush. The fairy promised to take him to where his mate was waiting, because she was already next to him. She was supposed to appear on a path among the pines, where the moonlight did not penetrate, and Marquis Marin ran to the right place. On such a dark and frosty night, the only thing the Marquis could encounter on the path in the forest was a cold. But suddenly he stopped and turned to the fairy again. The girls asked Loudspeaker what else he needed. He wanted to know if this girl would like him. But the fairy said that he didn't have to worry about that, because she had sprinkled a love potion on her eyelids, so she would fall in love with him at first sight. Therefore, the first person the girl should have seen should have been the Marquis, and he decided to hurry. Having made sure that the Marquise had left, the girls decided to leave too before they were noticed. It was very cold outside, and they wanted to get back into the warmth as quickly as possible. Suddenly, Betty saw a man come out of that terrible place, but she didn't want an innocent woman to suffer because of her plan. Seeing this man, Marquis Moraine was taken aback, but still he whispered, "Be my wife." The man who came out to meet him was Duke Janus. Not understanding what was happening, but still believing the fairy's words, Marquis Moraine whispered to His Excellency that he was beautiful, and then he added that he didn't know that he was actually a duchess. Duke Janus felt terribly humiliated by these words. Trembling all over, the Marquis whispered that he had committed a mortal sin. At this time, the girls were afraid that the Duke would kill them all. It was necessary to destroy the evidence quickly. In any case, the card only had the names of Lucifer and this guy written on it. They returned to the palace and sat down at the table. During this time, the girls have already been lost, but they said that they made snowmen in snow. After thinking for a while, the elders decided to punish them for this a little later. After all, their faces were white with fear. The Duke was informed that the children had been found, and he was glad that they were all right. There was some crazy guy wandering around outside. Hearing these words, Elna was a little scared, but the Duke calmed her down by saying that he had already caught him. Betty was surprised that after everything that happened, the Duke spared him. It even seemed to her that the Duke was aware of what they had done. Taking the girl with him, he wished the others to be careful and not catch a cold. On the way, he asked Betty if her choice of friends was conscious. He approved of the Marquis's daughter, but he had to be more careful with the one who was very different in status. He was worried that Betty would be used, because there was no need for that girl unless she was used as a servant. The difference in levels and so on down the list probably referred to Alexandra, the Baron's daughter, but as the Duke said, it won't be. And what formed between them was nothing other than conscious complicity. Betty was sure that Alexandra and Elizabeth would never betray her under any circumstances. This connection was much stronger and more reliable than bribed friends. I asked if the Duke had gone outside, and he confirmed that he had gone out to get some air. But suddenly, some crazy guy tried to hug and kiss him. Janus said that this man was completely out of his mind. He waited for a random woman to pass by to pester her, but he caught the Duke. Janus learned that it was the son of the Marquise of Moraine. Betty asked what Janus had done, because it was all strange. The Duke returned back too early, and he returned alone as if nothing had happened. After all, he should have made a noise and said that he would bring this scoundrel's ship. Smiling slightly, the Duke asked again if she really wanted to know what he had done to it, and he told Betty that he cut off his wrists and fed them to the dogs. And then he laughed and said that he was joking and would never have done something like that. After all, he was not some reckless bandit, and legal procedures had to be followed. For example, to ruin a family and take away their title so that society turns away from them. But no matter what the Duke said, the girl really wanted to get away from her. She was shaking all over, although when she played it would not be cold, and the Duke suggested that she return home. To escape from Janus, it was necessary to get closer to Duke Lucifer, and Betty screamed that she didn't want to go home, but was going to dance at her first ball. The Duke had no choice but to stay with her. Well, here comes the princess. She could easily be called the queen of this ball. The princess's partners were determined in advance. Among men of approximately the same age, those with a higher status danced first. Of the minors in the empire, Duke Janus had the highest status. Betty was sure that he should have been the first to dance with that princess. She was very upset that she had not used this information as an argument earlier, but the Duke answered her that he had changed. Janus gave the first dance to the little Duke Gladio. The girl was very surprised that this could be done. The princess born from the flower of the world tree was like his incarnation, and ignoring the duty of accompanying her was absurd. Betty even asked if this would be an insult to the princess. The Duke laughed, saying that he could even be hanged in the square for this. Looking at all this, Betty decided to find another job, but Janus reassured her, saying that even if he died, he would not allow her to suffer humiliation again. In fact, it was an unofficial event, and no one cared about these dances. At this time, everyone was invited to go inside and asked to be polite. The novel's main character was referred to there as the original. She realized the essence of love thanks to Duke Gladio and defeats Duke Janus, bringing peace to humanity. This ideal protagonist was Princess Catherine. Betty couldn't believe she was a minor character in the novel. Katerina was the true protagonist of this world, the savior who would lead humanity, stuck in the clouds, to eternal salvation. The Duke asked Betty if she wanted to see her up close, but she refused. She couldn't understand how Janus could dance with her at all, leaving the princess. Everyone around couldn't take their eyes off her. There was definitely something about the princess that caught my attention. There was a certain fragility about her, as if she could crumble at any moment. Janus didn't even think that Betty would like the new princess so much. But there was definitely something mysterious about her, and also something reminiscent of melancholy. The Duke reprimanded Betty, saying that she was out of time because she was looking around. She had nothing to say in response, because she really did miss the target. Due to the difference in height, the position was very uncomfortable, and Betty's movements were out of tune with the music. It was the first time anyone had seen a person dance like that. Betty didn't even think that she would attract so much attention. Even those who were watching the princess turned to her. The Duke said she was like a butterfly. Betty couldn't understand the expression on his face. Perhaps it was praise. Finally, the ball was over. Betty was walking very tired. But suddenly, Duke Lucifer called out to her. He suggested that she take a little rest and talk alone. This was very convenient for Betty, because she wanted to be friends with him. After all, instead of being embarrassed in the bustle of the dance, it was much better to just chat in the relaxation room. Betty was very grateful to the Duke for this offer. But suddenly, Janus said that the Duke said this only because he was sincerely worried about her. Or maybe he didn't want to embarrass the girl and be embarrassed himself during the dance. She couldn't figure out what brand he was carrying. Janus began to tell Lucifer that Betty should beg him to dance with her because she was so looking forward to this ball. Duke Lucifer began to say that the girl was not at all obliged to agree to his proposal. Betty began to assure that she herself wanted to rest a little. Lucifer said that just because she does what she wants doesn't mean she's a bad child, and he invited Betty to dance with him. Now he was playing games with the devil. Betty agreed to Lucifer's proposal and gave it to him. Janus wished her a good time. The girl couldn't do anything until she was in a hurry to get away from the Duke, so I could only hope for his good intentions. The next music was for a waltz. Lucifer remembered that the girl seemed to be in pain, but her legs. He took her in his arms, but even so his movements were confident and graceful. It was hard to believe that he and the son of the Marquis of Marin were the same age. There was no hint of hesitation in his light steps. Besides, it was worth noticing the strange expression on the Duke's face. Lucifer heard that the girl was going to enroll in a school for guides and asked if there was any deeper meaning to this decision. Betty replied that 13 was the appropriate age to enter. Lucifer didn't immediately believe her age. Betty decided to change the subject and started saying that she had heard how remarkable Lucifer was. He replaced Princess Veronica as head of the family. For him, it was a source of pride that he was obliged to protect. And suddenly, Betty asked what she was going to do during the summer holidays. But he hadn't built any yet. Vitya usually returned to the estate in the summer to find out how things were going. But in her attempt to befriend Lucifer, she missed one important thing, and that was the warning mentioned in the novel. It was necessary never to show interest in the affairs of Duke Lucifer during balls. As soon as the girl inquired about his affairs, he immediately poured out liters of information on her, with numbers, calculations, and so on. Although it was quite interesting to listen to him, Lucifer had a resourcefulness in matters of business, and he was good at calculations. Betty kept up a little conversation with him, but instead of being offended by the pointing out of shortcomings, his eyes lit up with interest. It was impossible to force people to make donations. It was impossible to call something done for some benefit a good intention. Duke Lucifer was a man with exceptional opinions on social issues. Betty knew he wanted publicity, but beyond that, he needed something that would interest people. She suggested that he sell at charity fairs and auctions what would greatly delight members of high society. Even here, there were so many young guys who could give him several hundred albans without hesitation. To do this, for example, he needed to dance the next dance with Duke Janus, because ordinary people are guided by desires, not good intentions, and it is easier for them to ruin their wallets. Betty suggested that he have lunch with the Duke at the auction in the summer, or go see a play. Lucifer thanked her for the advice, but he thought he couldn't exploit other people's kindness and compassion in that way. But in the end, Lucifer had to accept her offer and ask for help. Although the Duke was a very naive man, Betty really liked him. She even thought about bringing him together with Elena, at the same time removing Count McKean, putting Elena in his place. Then Betty would be able to control her, who stood at the head of the McKean family, as she pleased. Meanwhile, the little Duke approached her, and the girl asked if he was having a good time at the ball, and he replied that, of course, this was so. Suddenly, he asked her to dance. The more connections Betty made, the better, because she was determined to escape from Duke Janus at all costs. But she didn't really want to dance for this. Saying that she was a little tired, Betty invited him to sit down and rest. But suddenly, Janus approached her and said that she should not play with the gloomy youths living as hermits in the north. But the little Duke stopped him and asked him to wait, because he and Betty had not yet finished their conversation. But Betty herself was already eager to finish it as soon as possible before it became a big problem. Suddenly, the princess intervened in their conversation and asked if this was the Betty who was receiving support from Duke Janus. She came up to ask for a dance on behalf of her shy younger brother. Betty was very nervous talking to Princess Veronica Matthias because they barely knew each other. The princess was glad that Betty agreed, and she asked to bring the shy blue-haired young man who was sitting nearby. But from the expression on his face, it was clear that he was interested in Betty. But suddenly, Princess Veronica whispered into the girl's ear that she knew about her prank on the Duke an hour ago, and then she said that her brother would come before the dance began. The Duke was not to know about her prank under any circumstances, and Betty had to tell the little Duke that they had asked for a dance first. The little Duke asked permission to ask his question after she had danced this dance. Betty knew that in this case he could not be refused, but Janus intervened in their conversation, saying that girls should not communicate with gloomy northern men, and asked him to leave. And then he asked what Princess Matthias had just told the girl. But Betty could not tell him the truth under any circumstances. She decided to change the subject and asked Janus why he was talking to the little Duke like that. But he didn't see anything bad in his words. He just didn't want Betty to get carried away by such pretty fools. Janus believed that they were only concerned with maintaining their reputation and that they were nothing but trouble. Betty thanked him for his concern, but he couldn't tell her who to talk to. After all, the younger Duke Gladio made sure that she did not feel awkward, and she liked Duke Lucifer as a person. Janus asked what she saw in him, since they had only seen each other a couple of times. Betty began to explain that he was the one who first invited her to dance and was worried that she wouldn't be able to settle in here, showed concern for her, for which she was grateful to him. Secondly, everyone spoke of him as a good-natured and decent person. He spoke with such enthusiasm about the estate's poor relief efforts that Betty was sure the world needed a nobleman like him. After listening to her, the Duke remained silent in response, and then he asked if she had said everything she wanted. Betty knew that the angrier the Duke got, the calmer he looked, and judging by his excessive politeness, he was now simply furious. According to him, Lucifer was simply kind to all people, and was still a duke because he had nothing to give his people. In response, the girl said that she does not make friends in order to necessarily receive some benefit. But Janus continued to say that a man who is kind to everyone indiscriminately is incredibly stupid. Janus believed in being kind to those who truly mattered, but Betty felt that such disregard did not justify his evil actions. The Duke asked her what she thought he had done that was so bad. He wouldn't have led such a decent life as Lucifer, but at least for Betty, he didn't do anything bad. He gave her the best. The girl said that if anyone heard him, they might think that she forced him to take her under his wing. She understood that he treated her so well only because he needed her as a guide. After all, he had found her so successfully, without money or parents, and she was no different from the dirt on the road. The girl understood perfectly well that he was going to keep her close, under the pretext of helping and use her as a guide when needed. Betty was so angry that she was overly honest. Without saying another word to her, he left. Then she remembered how he taught her to dance, and he calmed her down by saying that she was his partner and must definitely dance at the ball. And the other children will dance only slightly better than her, and with each such lesson her skills grew. Princess Veronica only dreamed of this ball ending as soon as possible. She noticed the other girls commenting on Betty's clumsy movements. They laughed and said that nowadays gentlemen were so kind that they invited such girls to dance. They said that Betty didn't even realize it, which is why she was so smug. But Veronica thought she was quite cute. Betty was certainly not a typical beauty, but she was undeniably charming, And the more you get to know her, the stronger her charm becomes. To pull off that prank, this girl made friends whose status was higher than hers. It was quite amusing, but the brother had to cope with her instructions. Janus entered one of the rooms and asked if there were any available girls. He needed 2 blondes. Everyone looked at him with incomprehension. The girls invited him to sit down, and then he said that he was a little bored. "That's why I asked if there was any way I could have some fun." Miss Charlotte began to juggle skillfully in front of him. Another one started to assemble houses of cards, and some even sing with a spoon in their hands, pretending to be a microphone. Well, all this seemed very boring to the Duke. Then one of the girls decided to show him an exotic plant that was brought from the other end of the continent, but this was also boring for him. Then they decided to show him rare animals that one of the ladies collected. It was a red panda. The girl handed him a bamboo leaf to show how much he loved them. But suddenly, the animal stood on its hind legs, showing aggression. This is how he tried to scare the Duke. And suddenly, Janus asked to sell the animal for 1,000 albans. At this time, Veronica's brother came to Betty and said that his sister wanted to invite her. He himself did not understand what she wanted, but he needed to convey the answer. Betty replied that she accepted the invitation. After all, in her situation, she couldn't do anything else. One of the girls asked if Betty had just received an invitation from Princess Veronica. Betty thought that perhaps other ladies had received such an invitation too. The girls were afraid that the Duke would now kill them. Betty asked if they had seen the Duke, and they replied that he had gone to the living room. Betty ran in that direction after saying goodbye to the girls, because the matter was urgent. She accidentally remembered a relationship experience from a past life. Betty remembered the words of people whose faces she had already forgotten. The Duke's face was definitely not like that. It seems her memories were distorted, and she was careless before. Betty just didn't want to give the Duke too much freedom. She wanted to draw a line between them, and now she would have to apologize. Maybe it wasn't even worth getting angry about. But with countries and people, it could also be difficult. The girls asked him to let them support the cute little animal, but he refused and asked them to switch places. Betty understood that it was not people who made people worry, and then enjoyed themselves alone. Then she decided to go back and concentrate on her own affairs. Suddenly, the Duke stopped her and asked if she was already leaving, and he asked if she just wanted to see him or give him these flowers. Betty actually brought them for him and said she was grateful to him for dancing. The girl handed him the flowers to put into his buttonhole, but he asked her to do it herself. Betty thought he was nothing but trouble. She wanted to give him the flowers, so she stopped for a second. At this moment, the Duke asked him to stop because he wanted to tell him something. He was afraid that she might misunderstand him because he was just talking to those ladies. He was irritated and wanted to put his thoughts in order alone. But they chatted constantly, leaving him without strength. Betty knew that ladies of a much lower status than the Duke would not dare to behave like that. They buzzed in his ear because he allowed them to do so. She couldn't understand why it was necessary to lie so stupidly. Suddenly, the Duke said that he had bought a bear from one of the girls, but Betty didn't care about his purchases, and she said that then she would go. The Duke started shouting why Betty could meet men and date them whenever she wanted. But if he talked to his girlfriends, it hurt her. Well, she replied that she didn't care at all. Janus asked the girl not to lie, but it was the truth. Taking the little animal in her arms, Betty once again told him that it was time for her to go. The Duke asked if she really wanted to leave him forever, but there was not a single place in the empire where he could not find it. Betty knew that with that expression on his face, his threats were empty words. He was not in the best shape, so she decided to give in to him. And saying that she was very tired, she asked if they could just go home. And she pretended that she really wanted to sleep. Taking the girl in his arms, the Duke said that they were going home. Betty couldn't figure out what was going on in this psycho's head. A few days later, the Flower Fairy's ball ended. And at first, the red panda delighted the Duke. But soon he became completely bored with her, so Betty had to take care of her. The animal liked the girl and constantly climbed into her bed. The girl decided to read before going to bed. It was a story about 2 twins, Han and Yoon. When human sins led to the flood, Yoon disappeared. Han looked for her sister everywhere, but could not find a trace. While Khan was grieving, the tree of life grew on her back. 4 angels descended to her, unable to forget her sister. The raging sea swallowed up more and more land day after day. The tree she once grew was meant to save the desperate. An angel with an olive branch told how to turn a tree into a Yggdrasil. The patron angel of the full moon granted Khan eternal peace. Above the blocks, the tree of life saved the continent. The world was cleansed of monsters by the black flame created by the angel of destruction, and humanity enjoyed the life-giving land created by grief, Khan. Day after day, the tree died, tempted by longing for Un, when the angel, who had not previously uttered a word, turned to the Almighty of this world. Just as she was destined to save the world, her sister was given a new life, but she needed to let go of her grief. Hearing these words, Yggdrasil stopped yearning for his sister and sent his flower to bloom. Looking closely at Noah's kingdom in heaven, one of these flowers was Ursula, the first princess born from Yggdrasil. Since then, Yggdrasil has sent flowers whenever the sky continent was in danger. While reading this book, Betty thought that the mention of 4 angels was very symbolic. The sword captured by the black flame was Gladio. The son of justice was Sol. The dove holding the olive branch was Matthew. The lily and the moon represented fidelity and purity. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by the Duke. This was the most filthy and treacherous of all the Januses. The girl dreamed of spending at least one day peacefully. He didn't know how to please her, so he brought her one jar. In his opinion, all the girls liked it, but he didn't even understand what he was talking about. Having placed the whole bag on the girl's bed, he said that he brought it instead of the flower fairy. Janus asked if she liked it all. The Duke bought up almost everything, but he didn't even notice it about himself. Suddenly, Betty saw in the bag a Stephanotis flower, which had a slight power of purification, and medicines from it were used in emergency cases by priests and pharmacists. He could purify the power of the transcendent without a conductor. But it was illegal for the townspeople to take it due to hallucinations and paralysis. However, Duke Janus took Stephanotis extract regularly to control his strength. He bathed in all the extract in the empire and drank it until he passed out. Suddenly, he told the girl that he knew that she didn't like it. But even so, Lucifer was not an option for her. But Betty wanted to talk about it in the morning. Then he said that fairies come at night and leave gifts while she sleeps. The Duke didn't want to wake the girl, but since she wasn't sleeping anyway, he wanted to talk to her. Since he insisted so much, Betty decided to listen to him. He couldn't control her, even if he wanted to. He understood that Betty was wary of him, and that she didn't have any normal friends. There were people around her who were hungry for money, not for an exchange of feelings or anything like that. Betty couldn't imagine that a bastard like the Duke would worry about her so much. If she liked these young men so much, then he couldn't forbid her from communicating with them. Betty knew that when Janus was not in his right mind, he was always overly pessimistic. She asked him not to blame himself so much. After a good night's sleep, this problem will seem absurd to him. The Duke wondered what he had done to such a good-natured angel. He wanted Betty to be happy. She shouldn't have given a damn about anyone. Betty thought that it wasn't that hard to be happy, but the main thing is that it was what she really wanted. The Duke began to shout that Lucifer would give his wife's last garment to a passing beggar. But he didn't like Lucifer himself, even though he pretended that it wasn't so. Janus promised to make Betty the ruler of Sol. Betty no longer understood what kind of nonsense he was talking about. Suddenly, he asked if she and her friends needed a house where they could meet, but Betty said no. From that moment on, Janus promised to do whatever the girl wanted. Betty started screaming that she didn't want to go to the school for guides. She wanted to get away from the Duke and no longer suffer from his anger. Well, these were just her dreams. If Betty wanted to go to Gladio, the Duke would allow her. Although he thought that Gladio's people were just terribly creepy, and it was also very cold there, but Janus promised to visit her. He asked if Betty had ever seen Duchess Gladio. The Duke was sure that they were keeping her locked up in the castle. He claimed that he hated it when other people were limited. In fact, the rumors about Duchess Gladio were a lie. She was having a hard time in the northern part, but in fact she stayed in the Duke's castle because of a common cold. Betty asked Janus to calm down. The girl wanted to get out of bed, but he stopped her. She thought the Duke would do better to get some sleep, and he said that he would return to his room himself. There was no need to wake anyone up for this, and the fact that he was about to leave was already a relief for her. The Duke himself realized that he was confused. Suddenly, he asked who Betty liked, Sul or Gladio, and which of them she would like to marry. But Betty replied that she didn't like any of them. Now, the Duke began to insist that she tell him who she liked. To get him to leave her alone, Betty said that any husband would suit her. Suddenly, the Duke asked if he fell in love with her. Would she live with him? These words scared her very much. After all, Betty was only 13 years old, and it was too early for her to think about such things. Hearing this figure, the Duke asked when he had managed to grow so much. Now he thought about how quickly children grow up. Betty wanted to finish this conversation and asked permission to accompany the Duke to his room. It was necessary to very gently persuade him to leave. Under the influence of the plant, the Duke began to think about how many women had ruined their lives because of an unsuccessful marriage. Betty pretended to understand what he was saying and agreed with him on everything. She said that she would never marry and would live happily. But Janus insisted that she still didn't understand what he was talking about. After all, one day she will fall in love, and her existence next to him will be filled with meaning. Then she will need to be careful. He said that one should never make a wish to the tree of life, because if it gives something, it will soon take it away again. Betty knew Janus had gone off the rails again. His eyes were bloodshot. He claimed that he could think clearly, but his heart, sensing something was wrong, was beating like crazy. In the morning, a maid came to Betty and asked how she slept. The girl also wished Lucy good morning, but suddenly she thought that perhaps he was still asleep. After all, she saw real cookies on the tray, and Lucy confirmed that the owner had given her permission to make them, but only today. And after them, Betty had to brush her teeth thoroughly. The maid confirmed that sometimes the owner becomes slightly emotional after taking the extract. Betty decided that she didn't need to look for a hidden meaning in this. Perhaps the Duke simply wanted to apologize. Apologize for scaring her so much yesterday. He already apologized yesterday, and then quietly returned to his room. Lucy also handed the girl a letter addressed to her. It was from Lady Veronica. After reading it, Betty came to the Duke to tell him that she had received an invitation from Lady Veronica and wanted to go shopping with her friends. But he was lying on his bed, covered almost over his head, and did not answer. And then he dryly replied that she could go. The girl understood that he was feeling unwell, perhaps because he was young and not yet accustomed to the medication. But Betty got permission and decided to go to her friends. There were rumors that Lady Veronica was very picky. Well, Betty wasn't scared by this. Lady Veronica was simply going through a late teenage rebellion. If she decides to pour tea on someone's head, one of the girls wanted to explain to her that she shouldn't do that if she was given a gift. But the other one said that this shouldn't be done, because she had delved into studying this topic. She invited her friends to look at her notes and choose a gift for Lady Veronica together. These were real calculations of an excellent student. To start with, they decided to stop at Candace's bakery. The driver offered to help you with money if they didn't have enough, but the parents taught the girls not to borrow money unnecessarily. There were some boys standing around the corner, and one of them received money for his work. One of them was very worried about Meg. It was use. But he shouldn't have done that, because they said she was a servant in a rich house. Suddenly, he thought that maybe she hadn't stolen these things, because the rich loved to dress their servants with gloss. Well, the scraps of delicious dishes were at her disposal, and the boy could not allow her to make do with black bread and spoiled fruit as before. But he earned too little to provide for her, and he asked if there was another job that paid more than 50 albans, but the work was more expensive and dangerous. Still, Yus asked that if anything else was found, be sure to tell him. On the way, the boy passed by a shop window with expensive dresses. They were made of expensive silk and velvet. They were so beautiful that it was painful to look at them. Yus definitely decided that he needed more money because he had to fulfill her wish. The girls stood near the store and discussed a new set of cups for Lady Veronica. Among them, the boy saw that very Meg. It was very surprising to meet here. Yus decided to approach her, but looking at his appearance, he decided that it was not now. He couldn't show himself to her like that. The boy decided to wait for the right moment. Yus went into a shoe store nearby. The boots he liked cost 2 albans, but that was too much for him. After all, with this money, he could buy bread for a whole week. But he still needed these shoes, and he also decided to buy flowers. But first, it was necessary to choose which ones he would give. But he didn't understand them at all. Then he asked the seller to assemble a bouquet to his taste. He asked the boy in detail about who this gift would be for, and then put together a stunningly beautiful bouquet. As he stepped outside, Yus hoped that Meg was still there. He carried this bouquet very carefully, afraid of ruining it. But first, I needed to find a quieter street. Suddenly, the boy Yus collided with someone on the sidewalk. Surprisingly, it turned out to be Meg. Only a huge bouquet was left lying in the middle of the street, and the one who was carrying it seemed to have evaporated somewhere. The girls started saying that it was a ghost who had his eye on Betty. The girl, clutching the flowers to herself, was not afraid of this at all. The flowers in that bouquet were fresh and beautiful. She really wanted to arrange them outside, so she picked up a few and kept them for herself. Although this day ended with another mystery, it was wonderful, and he was also very tiring. But suddenly, Betty heard someone scratching in the silence. She even thought it might be Freddy Krueger. After all, he was a demon who controlled us, killing people in their nightmares. Ghosts didn't eat people, but Freddy Krueger killed them for fun. And Betty decided to find a maniac who would be scarier than Freddy Krueger. She ran into the Duke's room and asked if he was sleeping. But he was sleeping and did not answer. The girl even thought that it was Freddy Krueger disguised as the Duke, or that she was trapped in a nightmare that Freddy sent her. After all, in his dreams, Freddy could do anything and even change his appearance. Betty asked loudly again if the Duke was sleeping. She couldn't ask Freddy directly if he was okay, so she decided to check if he had slept well. Janice decided that Betty had come to check in the middle of the night whether he was alive. But the girl continued to stand next to him and did not leave. When she looked at him like that, the Duke couldn't sleep. Janice asked if it was scary to sleep alone. She began to tell the Duke that she had bought herbs with her contaminating side effect from white musk. But suddenly, the girl was horrified to see the Duke standing up. He was completely naked and always slept like that, and Betty came to him without permission. She ran out of the room as if scalded with boiling water. Having run into her room, she began to convince herself that she had not seen anything, and the fact that she doesn't remember anything. And then she saw the little animal under the bed. She realized that it was definitely not Freddy Krueger. At this time, Christine received a letter from Lady Veronica. After reading it, she became furious. She understood perfectly well that she wanted to cancel her tea party under the guise of a cold, although at that time she was drinking tea with other girls. The maid who came to Christine decided to ask what Lady Victoria had written to her. Frowning, the girl asked if Laura was really that interested in knowing this. Realizing that she had exceeded her authority, the maid apologized, but Christine still kicked her out. She walked over to the table with her perfume and picked up one bottle, and she threw it and smashed it to pieces, blaming Betty for everything that happened. Victoria liked the girl who danced with her brother. The other girls supported her, saying that Betty was very sweet, and that it was not for nothing that she had gathered these sycophants around her. Victoria always wanted to surpass her older sister Veronica. Lady Veronica invited Betty to the Duke's estate, which meant that she was interested in Betty. And Victoria will not calm down until she takes everything away from her sister. She probably wants to lure Betty into becoming her minion. These thoughts did not give Christine any peace, because she suffered so much trying to be kind. Christine had suffered from high fever since childhood, but when she drank Peter Koss's tea, the fever disappeared without a trace. If she had known about this tea earlier, she would have been able to attend the princess's coronation and meet Duke Janus and young Gladio. Christine told Laura to come in and help her. While the maid was combing her hair, the girl counted to 10 to calm down. Her father taught her this, and it really worked. Christine became sweet and kind again, and thanked Laura for her help. In the story of the minor villain, Duke Mattia was not so important, and was described as a cheerful and intelligent man who helped Christine. Just like him, his garden did not wither even in winter. The maid invited the guests into Lady Veronica's drawing room. When the girls saw this room, they were seriously scared. It was so creepy that it was scary to go in there. Betty saw that there was a huge ant sitting on the cup. It didn't add to her appetite at all, but Lady Veronica needed her tea. This is how the hostess showed her hospitality. Betty told her friends that she would be stepping away for a while. She felt sick from being in this room, and she went to at least wash her face. But then she realized that she didn't know where the restroom was. But she still managed to find a door similar to the one she needed. But the door was somehow strangely too big. But Betty made a mistake and wandered into Duke Mattia's bedroom. This meant that she was somewhere in the center of the estate. It was necessary to get out of there urgently. But suddenly, someone called out to Betty. It was Duke Mattia, and he was just sleeping in his bed. Not seeing who entered, he thought it was a maid. He held out a jug of water and asked what time it was. Betty hoped that he didn't remember the voice of every maid and decided to answer him. He asked again about the time and asked if Hilda had arrived. Betty replied that his wife would arrive in a few hours, and he asked to be woken up later. The girl decided to run away while it was still possible, but she still didn't understand how to get back to the living room. She was lost. Coming out of the next door, she found herself in a garden, but suddenly she met an elderly woman who asked how she ended up there. She handed Betty the key, and she told me not to give it to anyone and to always keep it with me, and also try not to lose it. The gait of this lady was similar to that of Lady Veronica. Perhaps it was Duchess Mattia. The key looked more like a decoration than a real one, and was too precious to give to a stranger. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a maid appeared. It was Lady Veronica's maid, Julia, and she took it upon herself to escort the elderly lady. Julia asked Betty if she left, because Miss Victoria had caused her inconvenience, but Betty said it was okay. She was so captivated by the beauty of the estate that she ended up in the garden, but she didn't want to walk here without asking. Lady Veronica was even gloomier than at the ball. Judging by her appearance, one might have thought that she was going to a funeral. Betty decided to show Veronica what the Duchess gave her. Veronica said it was meant for her, and then she said Betty could keep it. After all, Grandma gave it to her, so now it's hers. Betty couldn't figure out whether Veronica wanted her to take it or not. When the girl suggested that perhaps the Duchess had given it to her by mistake, Veronica replied that she could not doubt their grandmother's decisions, and then she asked if Betty liked to eat. The girl began to worry that she might be fed something terrible. Gathering her strength, she said that she didn't want to eat it. But then she changed her mind and said that since Veronica cooked it, she would try it. Actually, it turned out to be just caramel. Betty thanked Lady Veronica for the treat. She even began to worry that it had turned out so awkwardly and that she might have offended Veronica. And suddenly, he asked if the girl trusted Janus, and she answered that she did. But Veronica didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone at all, not the four families, not even her own family. She admitted that their grandmother had not gone crazy on her own, but that someone had helped her, and so she also asked them not to lose the key. And then, turning around, she told Betty to take her friends, and they left. She stood there and couldn't understand what she meant when she spoke about the four families of Duchess Mattia. The maid decided to take the girl to the others. Miss Veronica was already sitting at the table. Betty arrived just in time. The girl was so expecting that she would not be the main character, and she wanted her to disgrace herself in front of everyone. Miss Christine was simply beaming today. Peter said she had grown a lot since they last met. Mr. Peter Koss may have started out as an ordinary merchant, but he gained power among the nobility. He was successful in preparing medicines for conductors and transcendentals. His teas and cookies containing beneficial herbs were in particular demand. Even the fever that Christine suffered from as a child subsided thanks to him. He heard the young ladies discussing the tea party at Duke Mattia's, but Miss Christine could not honor them with her presence due to poor health. In response, Peter said that she needed to take care of her health. The girl thanked him for his concern. Suddenly, Christine found out that Elena was going to this tea party, although she was not even invited. Suddenly, Peter realized that he had taken the wrong collection with him. It was his new assistant who made a mistake. These leaves were similar to those he had given to Christine before, but they had a completely different effect. They helped with constipation. Their effect was so strong that the urge was immediate. Peter was about to go for another tea, but Christine asked him to leave this one. Peter thought she was joking. Christine saw a cookie that looked like a regular blueberry jam cookie, but it had chamomile added to it for a good night's sleep. The cookies clouded my mind and slowed down my reaction time. If I ate them with tea for constipation, I could expect trouble. Christine thanked Peter for the information and decided to take it all. She came up with the idea of using her sister as an excuse. The tea would end up with Betty, and Laura, without even realizing it, would help her with it. The main thing was to get her to eat these cookies. The other girls began to talk about Betty's amazing dance at the ball. Christine was even glad that Betty was engrossed in conversation and wouldn't notice anything, offering her cookies with local blueberries. Christina said she wanted to be friends with her, and she had no idea why she was so kind to her. Christine was already looking forward to having Betty under her thumb, but suddenly someone's hand intercepted this cookie. Lady Victoria also loved blueberry cookies. Victoria asked Betty to try her pie first, because their chef is the best in the empire. Victoria ate the cookies with the thought that after tea, Betty should trust only her. Christine knew that things had not gone according to plan, and that Victoria should not have eaten it. In the past, giving sleeping pills to commoners or poisoning them was common practice. But now, the cookies with sleeping pills were eaten by a noblewoman. Victoria really liked these cookies. She began to praise this treat to others. And the other girls also reached for the box of cookies. Victoria asked Christine to share the recipe. But it's good that everything turned out this way, because if they all fall into a stupor, then no one will think about the cookies. Christine thought the tea party would be full of intrigue, but in the end, it turned out to be a sleepy party. Only Christine and Betty were awake. All the guests fell fast asleep. Stepping out into the fresh air, Betty wondered what it was about those cookies that everyone was praising so much. Suddenly, someone called Betty, and she dropped the cup from her hands in surprise. The girl turned around to see who it was. Miss Elena stood in front of her. Betty asked if she had heard the boy's voice. Elena said that she brought something for her. It was not a small gift in the form of a scarf. Miss Elena embroidered the pattern on it herself. Betty really liked this gift. Elena became embarrassed and said that embroidery is the easiest activity. But Betty thought she was underestimating herself. She had golden hair like the departed countess and blue eyes full of calm. Betty wanted to ask her about Lucifer, but her excessive modesty prevented her. Betty asked what kind of flower Elena had on her scarf. Elena said that there were snowdrops, lilies of the valley, and wild roses. Elena asked if Betty liked gardening and embroidery. Betty didn't like any of it, but she asked Elena to teach her. Embarrassed, Elena said that she did not have enough skills to teach others. She inherited the count's title without the help of being. However, she would be constantly ruled by others, and it was a terrible life. Betty began to say that she was beautiful and capable, but these words sounded like flattery. Being beautiful was useless if, besides that, a person had nothing. This beauty is simply used and then written off. Elena asked Betty what was really important then, and Betty replied that it was money and power, and it was good if the girl wanted to get them. She wanted to help Elena with this. And suddenly, Christine came running and said that they urgently needed to go home because of the onset of a fever. But Elena didn't want to go home at all. Such conversations could have led to rumors about a commoner. The fall of their family was inevitable, but too quick, and things got worse after a quarrel with Duke Janus. Now, Betty's words seemed strange, but when the time comes, Elena will remember them and turn to her. Then they will see each other again, but not like girlfriends over a cup of tea, and as conspirators hunting for the title. It was time for Betty to go too. Suddenly, she noticed a strange gathering of servants. It turned out that all the fish in the pond suddenly died. Suddenly, Betty remembered one thing. Her cup of tea fell into this pond. The owner of the house woke up from the noise downstairs. He tried to understand what kind of monster could have killed his beloved fish. Betty tried to wake Elizabeth. Otherwise, I couldn't come to my senses and fell asleep again. The same thing happened with Alexandra. While everyone was busy with the fish, Betty had to leave urgently. Well, suddenly, she noticed the remains of cookies in a box on the table. I couldn't resist and took one of them. It was really very tasty. The blueberry jam was incredibly delicious and seemed to melt in your mouth. Christine insisted that she urgently needed to go home because she was shivering. The butler said that he would definitely inform her attending physician about this. It was all for their safety, and he asked for understanding. Elena asked the maid why they couldn't leave. The maid explained that they were safe here. She added that there was a commoner at the tea party who was poisoned by someone. Her cups may have contained tea laced with poison, which spilled into the pond and killed all the fish. Elena couldn't believe that they wanted to kill Betty. After all, who would want to kill a powerless commoner? But now Betty was fine and asleep. The tree of life protected her. Hearing this, Christine rushed to her sister, and she asked the maid to leave. Elena thought that Christine and Betty were the most shocked and she needed to protect them. And then Christine said that it wasn't poison, but a laxative that Mr. Cost brought, and she only wanted to play a joke on Betty. With tears in her eyes, she said that everyone had misunderstood everything, and she didn't want to kill Betty at all. Duke Janus arrived at the house of Duke Mattia. The first thing he asked was where Betty was. They explained to him that she was sleeping upstairs, and that traces of a sedative were found in the cookies she had eaten. It wouldn't have harmed her. Duke Mattia reported that he had already found Peter Kos, since no one else could have pulled off such a trick. Duke Janus asked if Lady McKean was there. Duke Mattia confirmed this, saying that she was about to leave, but they held her back. The conversation also took place with their maid. Elena reported that during tea time, Laura left for a few minutes. She confessed everything, and Duke Mattia asked her to repeat everything she had said before. She snuck into the kitchen and switched Betty's tea, but she didn't know it was poisoned. Laura reported that this was an order from Lady Elena. Elena was very confused. She had no desire to achieve anything, or rather, she did not have such an opportunity. She just wanted to help her family. Betty couldn't understand why Christine was so worried. Elena confirmed that it was she who gave the order to Laura. With tears in her eyes, Elena confirmed everything Laura said. Duke Janus did not want to threaten anyone, but only to help. But Elena really did hold a grudge against Betty. But the tea definitely didn't contain poison, but a laxative. Christine added that Betty was still of humble origin, and they would simply pay a fine if she died by accident. Attempting to kill a commoner was really no big deal. Well, Duke Mattia had no intention of tolerating poison in his place. If Elena is not punished for treason, it will cause a scandal. The poison ended up on the estate of the Duke, his wife, children, and elderly mother. But this could already be considered treason against the Empire, a very serious crime. Well, Elena continued to swear that it was not poison. Suddenly, Duke Mattia handed her some papers. He suggested that she make it look like her father had set it all up. After all, her future, and the future of her sister, were a priority. If she wanted a wedding, they would find her a partner. If a career was important to her, they would support her. But for Elena, going against her father meant going against her family. After the reparations are paid to Mattia and Janus, the estate will be returned to the imperial family, and the titles will be removed. But it is unclear whether children raised in a noble family will be able to live as commoners. But blaming his father would not end there. Duke Mattia intended to swallow up their entire family. The Duke tried to convince Elena that by such actions she was not betraying her father. But the girl did not want to shift this burden onto her father, saying that it was only her fault. Suddenly, Duke Janus said that Mattia was surprisingly cruel. Janus wanted to help, but there was one problem. By law, he could not protect Elena, but if she gives him some rights, then he will be able to help. Janus offered Elena to sign a contract, but this document was supposed to help her in her defense. At that moment, Elena remembered Betty's words, and she said that she needed to think about it. Elena said that she needed to read everything first before signing. Janus said that if she needed a lawyer, she could contact him. Elena thanked him for his help, but in reality, she had no one to go to. Betty couldn't figure out when she had fallen asleep. The last thing she remembered was eating cookies. When she woke up, she saw the Duke next to her, who told her that someone wanted to poison her. Hearing this, the girl was very surprised. She demanded to be told immediately what had happened while she was sleeping. After hearing the whole story, she understood that Christine and Elena did not want to kill her, but now everything was against them. The Duke was right. Christine only seemed like a child, but in fact she was not stupid. If she really wanted to kill Betty, she would have hired a professional. But then the Duke reported that Peter Koss had been found dead. The cause of his death was shock caused by drug addiction, which was completely out of keeping with his image. After all, he was the gentleman who pacified Christine's mysterious fever. Well, the Duke said that the autopsy showed that his condition was so critical that he could die at any moment. As a result, the mystery of why Peter made those tea leaves will forever remain unsolved. The Duke said that they simply started a trail, knowing that investigators would come, and it would take a long time to find them. There was someone else behind this poisoning attempt. Elna, Christine, and Peter were just pawns. Betty didn't have many values. She was an ordinary commoner whose life was not worth working so hard for. However, something has recently appeared that others might be interested in. Until things calmed down, Betty had to be under constant supervision. Since it was so dangerous, Betty suggested postponing the application. But for the Duke, this was out of the question. After all, this is exactly what the criminals were trying to achieve. This creature had only one goal: to take Duke Janus's mate. The one who staged the poisoning and ensured that Christina did not attend the coronation was one and the same person. It was time for training at the academy. Elizabeth and Alexandra were probably already sweating it out in the training camp, and Betty was lazing around at the Duke's estate. After that day, the Duke would fly into a rage whenever the girl disappeared from his sight for even a minute. Betty even asked if he considered such treatment inhumane, but he didn't even understand what she was talking about. From the day of the poisoning, the Duke literally tied her to himself with a silk ribbon. Janus suggested loosening the tape if the girl was tight. Betty wished she had some choice. She believed that it would be quite sufficient and safe for her to simply be inside the mansion. But suddenly, Janus announced that tomorrow they were moving to the Duke's castle. Betty was to remain under supervision until the question of who was behind the poisoning was resolved. The Duke's castle was also located closer to the academy, but Betty was very angry that she and Janus were always together, and he asked the girl to follow him. But while they were connected by this thread, she had no other choice. So far, she couldn't understand where they were going, but suddenly, a stunning picture opened up before the girl's eyes. It was a huge chocolate fountain, and also whole mountains of fresh fruit. Betty couldn't resist and immediately ran to get some chocolate. It was all incredibly delicious, sweet, and sour. But suddenly, she remembered that she was going to show how angry she was about being tied up. Janus asked the girl to tell him if she wanted anything else. From the outside, it seemed that the Duke lived as he pleased. He had a huge responsibility, and he made a choice every second. And the choice has always been a clash of values. Janus reminded her of how they had once discussed her friends. He understood perfectly well how much Betty valued her friendship, and he asked one of the servants to bring something. There were times when other values had to come before friends. Betty tried to figure out who was in the big bag. She decided that the Duke had killed someone, or was holding someone there by force. Janus actually didn't kill him, because he really could have been Betty's friend. He didn't have time to finish speaking, and the girl was already running as fast as she could to the rescue. Yus was found in the big bag with his hands tied. This is how he learned her real name. The girl apologized in front for deceiving her. This young man was truly her true friend. Yus actually told the Duke that he would regret it if he killed him just like that. Janus even untied his hands and ordered him to sit still while he went for tea. Yus told the girl that the Count had persuaded the maid to replace her tea leaves. Then Betty became so excited that she dropped the cup right into the pond. It turned out that at that moment, Yus called out to her. He followed her closely all this time. Because of his scream, Betty did not drink the poison. She thanked the young man because she really did survive thanks to him. These words made him very happy, and he was also very glad to see his friend. Just in case, Betty asked the Duke again when she was leaving for the castle. Before leaving, she would have liked to say goodbye to her friends, but the Duke insisted that she would still see them when she returned to the academy. But she will never see Yusa again. Janus compared the boy to a tame rat that constantly drags Betty around. The girl noticed that after the fairy ball, the Duke became quite lenient towards her friends. He even tried to remember their names, and given his nature, this could be called a change in character. Betty thought that this would be her last appearance in the capital, and then she suggested to Yus that they go for a walk together. The young man was very happy about this. Janus reminded that they could write letters to each other. He also promised to personally bring his friend to Betty during the holidays, and he also promised that they would go on a boat ride. But suddenly, he asked if Betty couldn't stand being separated for just 3 months. After all, the girl looked so complicated. The world collapsed simply because they would not see each other for 3 months. Janus started shouting, "Are all these people really such great friends to her?" And Betty quietly whispered that they really were friends. Then the Duke asked who he was to her. Now he looked like a time bomb threatening the sky continent. Betty certainly couldn't call him a friend, more like a sponsor or an employer. After these words, the Duke lifted her by the scruff of her neck like a kitten. He ordered Yusa to be returned back to the guild. Spring arrived unnoticed, and the day of entering the academy arrived. Janus couldn't believe that such a scumbag became the only son of Sol. But Betty reminded him that Lucifer was promoting a charity event. The girls managed to convince the Duke not to tie her up, at least at the entrance ceremony. The servant was supposed to help the Duke get to the academy. Janus and Betty came to a compromise. He held her hand throughout the entire entrance ceremony. The Academy's Student Council was headed by Chairman Lucifer Stater Sol, and the Senior Student Council was Lady Veronica Matthias. Poit watched as the first-year cadets entered, who would be responsible for the future of the Empire. Among them were Elizabeth and Alexandra, who looked very tense. A year later, Betty would also have to march in such formation. She was very worried about whether she would be able to adapt to school normally, since the Duke was putting pressure on the professors. Betty's own strength was never enough to escape to a place where Janus couldn't reach her. Then, the Empress appeared in the hall, and everyone was ordered to stand up to greet her. The Empress's speech went quite smoothly. She expressed her gratitude to the World Tree, and finally entrusted the future of the Empire to the cadets. Vincent, Count Matthias, came out to introduce the new recruits. He became a representative after showing the best results during training. Looking at him, it was unclear where the good-for-nothing count, whom Betty had seen at the banquet, had gone. Suddenly, Betty noticed that the Empress was looking at her sideways. She was actually looking not at the count, but at the girl. Smiling slightly, the Empress said that she now understood everything. Betty couldn't believe it, because they said that because she was raised by priests, the Empress didn't know emotions. Besides, the girl didn't understand what kind of nonsense she was talking. Looking, she said that life is wonderful. Until now, it seemed to her that she was just wandering along a familiar alley. Her days were so uniform that nothing out of the ordinary happened. But it turned out that a joyful meeting always awaited her, even if it was the most familiar alley. Now the Empress saw Betty for the first time. She called their